Okay, let's talk about some actual defenses to evictions. A common one is breach of warranty of habitability. Implied in law is a warranty that the apartment you're renting is habitable. It's fit for humans to live in. It's not gross, it's not unsafe. But if the rental property really is so gross, like if every surface is covered in mold, if there are cockroaches running around everywhere, a tenant can say, I'm not liable for the full amount of rent because this place is not worth the full amount of rent. The tricky part is then the tenant has to prove that the amount that they did pay for rent is the correct amount. It is a reasonable amount of rent. And this can be difficult because how do you prove how much 10 cockroaches reduce the amount of rent that's due, or how much rent you should pay for a place that has like 10% mold? Nevertheless, this can be a good defense to bring up because now you have this dispute about, well, how much is the apartment actually worth? How bad is the apartment? What are the conditions? And a landlord doesn't want to deal with all this back and forth. So maybe they'd rather just figure out a settlement. Another big one is defective or improper notice. In Illinois, before you file any eviction, you must give the tenant notice. If your eviction is for non-payment of rent, you must give the tenant at least 5 days to pay the full amount of rent that's due. Anything less than 5 days is no good. And let's say you call it a 5 days notice, but you date it incorrectly so that it only gives them 3-4 days, that's bad notice. And if that 5th day falls on a Sunday or a holiday, you got to give them an additional day. And let's say you give them a few extra days or even a few extra weeks before you file your eviction, but you attach that notice, your lawsuit is still going to get thrown out. And the same thing applies for month-to-month tenants when you're doing a no-fault eviction. The length of time that you have to give them in the notice depends on how long they've been there. For example, if a tenant has lived in the property for 3 years or more, you have to give them 120 days notice. If you give them anything less than that, your notice is bad and your eviction lawsuit will get tossed. But that's not it. Let's say you give them the correct notice, everything is right, but the tenant alleges improper service of the notice. In Illinois, there are only 3 proper ways to serve a notice to tenants who are still in possession of the unit. And that is by handing it directly to one of the named tenants who's living there, or by directly handing it to a person who's over the age of 13 who lives there, or by certified mail with a return receipt. If you have tenants that are still living there, you can't post it on their door. You can't slide it under their door. If you have not served it properly, your eviction will get tossed. Another one that we see a lot is retaliatory eviction. This is when a defendant alleges that a landlord is just evicting them because the tenant has complained to authorities about building code violations or some other condition in the apartment that needs to be fixed. This is usually a defense to a no-fault eviction because if a tenant just hasn't paid rent in a long time, the landlord can simply say, no, I'm filing this because you owe me 3 months of rent, not because you contacted the authorities about the apartment. It's also tough because the tenant would have to point to some sort of evidence that shows that the landlord has this improper motive behind his eviction action. At this point, I think I have to make a part 2 because I've still got like at least 3 more. But let me know what you think about those first couple.